Sorry, let me start again. So this is a short chapter, and on the one hand, it is short, yes, but on the other hand, it is said to contain the total knowledge of the Vedanta. In other words, it's called essence of Vedanta and Vedanta Shastra. And therefore, we find that this chapter, if you go to ashram in Pawai or in Chinmay Mission in anywhere, before they have the meal, the whole congregation chants this chapter. And it is only after the chapter has been chanted that the brahmacharis are given the food. So it is a reminder of all the different aspects of the Vedantic knowledge. And basically, it is an understanding the relations between Jiva, Jagat, and Ishwara. And what this chapter does is to talk about the basic tattvas, which we call Jiva, Jagat, and Ishwara, and also the ideas about what is bondage, what is it which is binding us in this world in the way it does, and what is moksha, and how are we going to go about getting to that ultimate destination of moksha, and what is the sadhana for that to be achieved. And the purpose of life as it is fulfilled through our sadhana, the phalashruti is also given. So we can kind of think about this chapter as something which I recommend everybody to memorize and to understand, because if you do that, then it becomes your summary of the Bhagavad Gita, as it were, and summary of the Vedantic knowledge. So let's proceed to see what the themes in this chapter are. So first of all, as usual, we're going to look at the logic and the flow of thought so far, and a brief recap of where the whole kind of thinking and the flow of thought is right up to this chapter. And this very interesting picture which Bhagwan paints for Arjun, this upside down Aśvattha tree, and what to do with it. So it is giving us a picture of a tree, which is a very interesting tree because it's an upside down tree, which is beyond our kind of understanding, as because we have never seen an upside down tree. So what does it really mean? And how are we to understand it within the context of what Bhagavad Gita is talking about? Then we go on to look at the goal. What is the goal? Just like what I talked about in terms of goal being the moksha, and how to reach moksha, which really means the same thing as reaching the Supreme Abode. And if you think about this Supreme Abode, we've been talking about it ever since the very beginning of the Bhagavad Gita. And the Supreme Abode is really the abode of the Supreme Being, as it were. Not literally speaking, but in a sense, in a metaphysical sense, it is where we can say, this is where the truth is, this is where the ultimate kind of reality is, and that is considered as the Supreme Abode. The next thing which Bhagwan then talks about is the Jiva. So Bhagwan has already talked about the goal and the Supreme Abode. Then we come to the next tattva, which is Jiva, and understanding really the journey of the Jiva and how it comes into being and how it goes out of manifestation and then repeats that cycle again and again and again, and therefore also kind of points towards really what is the point of all this sadhana which we are going to carry out, because we want to escape from this cycle of birth and death. And the other name for the Aśvattha tree can be said this samsara vraksha. And we know that vraksha is something which can be cut. And samsara vraksha means that this is the way in which we are located in this creation in such a way that we kind of get bound to the way in which we function and transact in our lives. And Bhagavan tells us exactly, really, how are you going to get out of this cycle of birth and death? Bhagavan also talks about in this section about recognizing Ishwara in the Jiva. And he says very distinctly that, how this is going to happen and how the Jiva is going to recognize Ishwara. Further on, he goes on to talk about the nature of the Supreme Purusha, the Supreme Being, and knowing the great secret. And this is the last section of this chapter, and it kind of summarizes really this great secret which has been talking in these verses. And of course, we need to also think about how to live through this knowledge which Bhagavan is going to give us, how to then think about what is the practical application of this knowledge which Bhagavan has given us, and this also we'll have a look at. So first of all, let's look at the logic and the flow of thought so far, and a kind of brief recap of where we have reached in conclusion to the last chapter and the beginning of this chapter. So just to remind ourselves, the overview of the Bhagavad Gita, which can be taken as 3 sections. The first section deals with the human condition. The second section deals with the divine and the knowledge of divinity. And the third one deals with the relationship between the two and the equality of these two, which is the Jiva and the Ishwara. So in this last set of 6 chapters, the relationship between the human and the divine, which is Purusha and Prakriti, is given. And in chapter number 13, we saw the field and the knower of the field. Again, a very interesting chapter, and a chapter which really then changes the channel, as it were, towards understanding this relationship between the human and the divine, the transactional and the eternal, which is also part of the theme which we are going to take up today. In chapter number 14, we saw the 3 gunas, description of Prakriti and the play of the gunas within this, and how the gunas actually play within ourselves as well. And what is it which is really binding us? Because if you are talking about moksha, then we also have to talk about that which is binding us so that we can get release from there. And in the chapter number 14, Bhagavan gives a clear picture as to what are the 3 ways in which we get bound in our transactional life, and how the changing gunas really are the play on the substratum of the unchanging reality. And in this manner, the way in which we are going to transcend the gunas is also given by Bhagavan in the way in which he describes what the sadhanas are and how are we going to proceed to transcend beyond this guna prakriti and beyond my own gunas, so that I can transcend to that which is the eternal. In this chapter then, Bhagavan kind of links the last chapter by saying, okay, we are going to transcend the gunas, but really where are we going to get to? We are going to get to that Supreme Being. So first of all, the knowledge, the field and the knower of the field, making us kind of understand what is that relationship between the Purusha and Prakriti, then the 3 gunas, which focuses on the Prakriti part of it. And then in chapter number 15, he focuses on the Purusha part of it. And this is the Supreme Being, Puruṣottama, and manifestation as Jiva. And further on, of course, chapter number 16, another set of verses which tell us about the Jiva and how it can get caught up between devilish expressions, which are expressions of the ego, and how we can transcend the ego in order to reach the divine. And what are the qualities which we can identify with each of these states? And the threefold faith, faith being the foundation of spiritual life, how to move from the rajasic and the tamasic way of having faith towards an enlightened faith, a faith which enlightens, and also an enlightened faith, which means a faith which is understood. And through this deep understanding, that the foundation of faith becomes so solid that we can move into the higher realms of our consciousness. and how to move to the sattvic state is described in chapter 17. And of course, the last chapter culminating into the summary of all knowledge and guidance. And then Bhagavan says to Arjun, I've told you whatever I need to tell you. Now it is up to you to decide what you want to do. See, even here, Bhagavan is giving him the choice. It's not that I'm telling you to do this and therefore you must do it. No, he says that, this is your decision. You make the decision. Empowering Arjun to follow the spiritual pathway. And therefore, it becomes the culmination of all this knowledge, which then Arjuna decides upon. So, going back to just the link between the last chapter and this chapter, Bhagavan says, my womb is the great Brahma, Mula Prakriti, and in that I place the germ consciousness. So here, matter and consciousness coming together, where Bhagavan says, I'm placing this germ, which is taken to be consciousness, into the womb, which is Mula Prakriti, and from which is the birth of all beings. This also relates to the previous chapter, number 13, which was about the Kshetra and the Kshetrajna, the Purusha and the Prakriti. And therefore, what it is telling us here also is that we are a composite of Prakriti and Purusha. What we have taken ourselves to be is that I am born in this matter, in this material world, is this material being, and I have taken myself to be that. So whatever forms are produced, he says, in all the wombs whatsoever, the great Brahma is their womb, and I am the seed-giving father. So again, we have to kind of think about how does that relate to this chapter as well, and we'll come to see that there is a relationship between Purusha and Prakriti, which is also given in the form of the upside-down tree. So the three gunas, which we saw in that chapter as well, is really the sattva, rajas, and tamas. These three qualities, born of Prakriti, bind the indestructible embodied one fast in the body. Now, remember, our enterprise really is to release ourselves from this bondage. And therefore, we got to understand really what this bondage is. So this bondage was described in a lot of detail in the chapter on the gunas. And each one of the gunas binds in a certain way with a certain quality. And this binding of the indestructible is again described in this chapter as well. You just have to excuse me because my throat is still kind of a bit sensitive. This Prakriti is a bit sensitive at the moment. So these are the references to the conjunction of Purusha and Prakriti, Kshetra, Kshetrajna, consciousness and matter. Okay. So the basic principle here is what? Is that we are a product of Prakriti and Purusha. And if we begin to understand this combination between Purusha and Prakriti in this way in which Bhagavan is guiding us, then we will be able to separate the two things out and understand really what is our true nature. So here's the logic of chapter number 15, which we're going to discuss today. The manifest tree of creation, the Aśvattha tree, with origins in unmanifest Brahman. So there is a manifest part and there is an unmanifest part. In this Aśvattha tree, it is depicted as an upside down tree because the roots are in the sky and the trunk and the branches and the leaves and everything else comes down into the space, which is what we can call as the transactional reality. Now, from here, what we see is that the individual Jiva in this totality of creation, like you and me, we individual Jivas get caught up in this creation through ignorance and identification. How is that? Ignorance is that I don't really know who I am, and therefore I take myself to be this individual ego identity. And we are caught up in this manifestation, which is the creation arising from the unmanifest Brahman. So then what happens? The Jiva can get released from delusion that I am this ego identity and from the cycle of birth and death. And how is that going to happen? By the strong acts of non-attachment to the ego self and by attachment to the true self. So remember, it's not only about cutting down the tree, which Bhagwan is going to talk about, but it is also that we have to attach ourselves to something. And of course, that is part of the logic of what we have been following so far, is get away from this ego self and attach yourself to that which is the true self. Then, by dwelling in that self, having attached to it, and we get absorbed in this identity of the self, we then reach the supreme goal of realization and liberation. So you can see this logic of chapter number 15 is quite clear in the sense that it is describing the Vedantic principles in a beautiful manner in which we can very directly understand really what is going on as far as the Jiva is concerned. Where does this Jiva come from? How is it going round and round in the cycle of birth and death? What is the relationship between Brahman and the manifest creation? And how can we then reach the Supreme Being through non-attachment to the ego self? So let's look at the upside down Aśvattha Tree and what to do with it, what Bhagwan is advising Arjun to do, and also us, of course, as to what to do with this upside down tree. So the Blessed Lord said, they, the wise, speak of the indestructible Aśvattha Tree. Remember, it is indestructible. In a sense, it is indestructible because its source is indestructible, as having the roots above and the branches below, and whose leaves are the Vedas. He who knows this tree in its entirety is also known as the knower of the Veda. He who knows it alone is the Veda knower. Now, what does it mean? Does it mean that if I, read about this tree and this very funny tree, upside down tree, and look at the, what the branches are and the leaves are and the buds, etc., then I become a Veda knower? In fact, we have to kind of go into the philosophical roots of this upside down tree and to understand what is the relationship between the various components of this tree and how it represents, in a sense, you and me as well. And if we understand our true nature as the Supreme Self through the Vedic knowledge, through the Vedantic knowledge, then we become the knower of Veda. So we'll go into more detail in that. Below and above are spread its branches, nourished by the gunas. Remember now the gunas we've been talking about in the last chapter, again mentioned here. And nourished by the gunas means what? It means that this continuation of this tree is only because it is being nourished by something. It is being nourished by these three gunas. And we will translate this in terms of our individual self, because if we say it is nourished by the gunas, on the one hand, the totality of creation is based upon the attributes of the gunas, and it is the attributes of gunas which continues this manifestation. But on the other hand, you and me in this totality of creation are also nourished by the gunas, and we also continue, but we continue in a different manner. we continue in the cycle of birth and death. And what it says is the sense objects are its buds. So Bhagavan is taking elements of the tree and telling us that when you look at the buds, which are just about to flower, then these are the sense objects. Now, see the relationship between the tree, and now we are looking at the sense objects. Where do the sense objects come in? Simply because Bhagavan is talking about the tree, creation, but at the same time, he's talking about the Jiva. And below in the world of men stretch forth the roots originating in action. See, another funny thing is that there are roots which are coming down and originating in action. And you know, these roots are kind of fixing themselves into the ground in such a way that they bind through action. Sense objects, action. What is the relationship between all these things? Let's see further on. So then Bhagavan says, it is a form not perceived here as such. Neither its end, nor its origin, nor its foundation, nor its resting place. In other words, this tree, we are not going to look outside the window and see a tree hanging upside down. In other words, it's not perceived by us as such. So there are two ways of understanding. Is that one, it is described in the text as such. So it's not perceived as described in the text, but also in a sense that unless we look beyond the creation, we are not going to perceive the way in which we are supposed to perceive this totality of creation. So neither its end, we can't see the end of it, nor can we see the origin, nor its foundation, nor its resting place. And then Bhagavan makes a direct statement as to what to do with this tree. He says, having cut asunder this firm-rooted Aśvattha tree with the strong axe of non-attachment. Okay, so what do we have to do? We have to cut the tree. And remember, it is a firm-rooted Aśvattha tree. And because it is such a strong tree, it is a very kind of strong tree in the sense that it can't be cut easily. And we know that, and just take an example. If we are talking about our attachment to various different things in the world around us, and I'm attached to this special masala tea which I make in the morning, so attached to it that if I don't get it, then I feel as if I missed something today, and my whole day kind of is up and down. That attachment leads me to action. And the object of my desire, which is the sense objects described here as the buds, it is so difficult to even get rid of this single attachment to the cup of coffee or cup of tea. But here we are talking about a huge tree, full of attachments, full of branches, full of things. And therefore, it requires a very strong axe of non-attachment. What is the relationship between non-attachment and the destruction or cutting of the tree? We will also find out. So before we do that, we can just kind of think about what we have talked about in the previous chapter, is that there is the vasanas which we have accumulated over many lifetimes, which then expresses itself manifestly as thoughts and feelings. And those thoughts and feelings kind of come together as a desire. And that desire is towards an object of that desire, which is visible to me through my senses. And through my senses, I can see the sense object. That sense object is that bud, which Bhagavan was talking about. When I go towards the object of my desire through action, and through my transaction, I get what I want as the object of my desire, then what begins to happen is that I become more and more attached to that object of my sense as I interact more and more with it. In other words, if I get a bar of chocolate and I enjoy it, I'm going to go back again and again to get that same bar of chocolate because I love it so much. Attachment through action. So, vasana to thought and feeling, which comes together as desire, which propels me to go out into the world, attain a certain object of my desire, which then creates more impressions in my mind, which feeds back into the vasanas. This, as you know, I have called it the loop of life. And this loop of life, I keep on going round and round and round. And this is where we get caught up in this Aśvattha tree. We have got caught up in the cycle or the loop of life, which keeps me bound into the transactional reality. And therefore, this strong acts of non-attachment is required in order for me to cut down these things which I'm attached to, and through that to deal with those desires which are being expressed from the vasanas. And therefore the whole kind of project, my spiritual project, is to purify the mind. Remember, purification is the first stage of our spiritual journey, and this is how it is going to begin. Now, I talked about this even in the last two chapters, is the nature of the divine according to the Gita. This is an overview. And remember, this is particularly from the Advaita Vedanta point of view, because there are, of course, different interpretations of the Bhagavad Gita from all the masters, and each master talks according to their tradition. And here, primarily, we look at Adi Shankaracharya-ji's interpretation. By the way, it is on Monday, it is his Jayanti, and we are having a program for that as well, so do join us. But this Advaita Vedanta has got a certain interpretation of the verses of the Bhagavad Gita, and absolute Brahman is the Nirguna aspect of Brahman, and it is what is known as the unmanifest Purusha, imperishable, indefinable, unmanifest, unthinkable, unchangeable, eternal. And here, what is inherent within this unmanifest Purusha is the power of Maya, and through that power, the whole of the creation takes place. This is what we can call as the cosmic Ishwara, Saguna, and this is the manifest prakrti. Remember, Purusha prakrti keeps on coming back again and again throughout the Bhagavad Gita. And this manifest prakrti is what we see in front of us right now, where we are located in this creation, which is really nothing but the manifestation of the unmanifest in terms of prakrti. And in that, of course, we have the individual avatar manifesting as Lord Krishna in this case, and of course, all the avatars which are there. This is manifest Bhagwan, Vishnu, Shiva, Brahma. And of course, you and me, personal jivas, which are amsha of the totality of divinity. And this Bhagwan also mentions in this chapter, is that part of me is now located in each one of you, and this is how the journey starts. So this manifest jiva takes itself to be the doer and the enjoyer, and supporter, permitter, witness, and these are different levels of expression of the divine in the jiva itself, which we have talked about in chapter number 13. So here is the descent into prakriti, into humanity, and this is the kind of reversal of that movement, which we then go towards ascent into godhood, the self. And how is that going to be done? Through sadhana, from the kshetra to the kshetrajna. So there we are. Here's the upside down tree. Now, if we just keep the last picture in mind, then we have got a picture here of the upside down tree, and we can see how it relates to this the way in which Bhagwan is describing Purusha and Prakriti. So here is the upside down tree with the roots in the air. And that is a representation of absolute Brahman, Nirguna Brahman, and unmanifest, which is also in this case, in reference to this chapter, is Uttam Purusha. Same thing, Brahman, ultimate reality, the true self. And of course, Maya, if we then look at what is then being manifested as a trunk and the rest of the tree, which is now kind of hanging upside down, as it were, is the totality of creation. Manifest Prakriti, in which we have the individual Avtara as Bhagwan, and we also have the Jiva, the Amsa, which is the Kshara. And Bhagwan mentioned there are two types of Purusha in this world, and he is going to talk about that later on. But here, the Akshar and the Kshara. The Akshara is that which is the absolute Brahman, and personal Jiva is that which is the Kshara in this bodily form. And the manifest Jiva is again the doer, enjoyer, and according to what Bhagwan has told us here, is that it is bound by action by the gunas. So now you can see what this tree is talking about. The tree, which is the upside down tree, is a representation of divinity and the creation and the relationship between Ishwara, Jiva, and Jagat. And these are the three elements which are really what is being described throughout the Bhagavad Gita and the relationship between those. So this upside down tree, let's start looking at it. Having cut asunder this firm-rooted Aśvattha tree with a strong axe of non-attachment. So let's think a bit more about that. Here, we have got a strong axe of non-attachment because the tree itself is very strong and very big. Now, what is this tree? And if we look at ourselves as, maybe we can think about ourselves as this upside down tree as well. Is that the root is here somewhere, which is the higher consciousness. And what is down here is the prakriti, which is the gross body. So we can think of this as ourselves as well. So this strong and big tree is really nothing but a representation of our attachments. We have got very strong attachments to everything. And therefore this tree for us is a very strong and big tree. Lots of attachments, lots of intense attachments. And therefore we require a strong axe of non-attachment to cut it down. So referring back to chapter number 6, when a man is not attached to sense objects or to actions, having renounced all thoughts, then he is said to have attained yoga. This is now called Yoga Rudha. Somebody who has attained perfection. By doing what? By non-attachment to sense objects or to actions, and even renouncing all the thoughts. And here renunciation means what? Disidentification and detachment from the sense objects. So again, you will see Bhagavad Gita is very consistent in terms of what he's talking about, and references are always found throughout the Bhagavad Gita. It is like a wonderful link of all the verses which bring this philosophy of the Bhagavad Gita, and it's practiced in such a coherent manner that it's the most wonderful text for me, at least. Is an absolutely wonder as how this Bhagwan has talked about all this very metaphysical, philosophical principles, but has brought us right down to the ground to understand really what is it that is required. So sense object, as we have seen, objects of desire and attachment to them. Just as I was explaining it, that the desire kind of reaches out to the object of desire, becomes attached to it. And this attachment to the object of desire really is where we get bound. And this bondage really is that I'm attached to things of this world, the material things. I can be attached to, the chair I'm sitting on. I can be attached to people around me. I can be attached to various different situations as well. And desires are expressed as choices and actions, which are then again arising from the vasanas. And this creates a sense of enjoyership of the sense objects and doership of the actions. So how are we going to cut this tree? By non-attachment. And where is this non-attachment going to come from? It is going to come from discrimination, viveka. And we have talked about viveka as well. Viveka is this discernment between what is the truth and what is the falsehood. What is Atma and what is Anatma. Atma, Anatma are also represented in the Aśvattha tree, because we are talking about Atma as the ultimate reality and Anatma as this material creation, including ourselves, having this material body, mind, intellect. So this discernment, if we then do it according to the knowledge which we derive from the scriptures, will lead us towards non-attachment. But it requires a very strong non-attachment, which in turn requires us to have a very strong sense of discernment, and which in turn requires us to have a solid foundation of the knowledge itself. Praman is required, and Shabda Praman is really the foundation of our Viveka, and that's why Bhagavan says that the leaves are what? The leaves are the verses of the Vedas. And if you think about that, that is what is required. That is what is going to nourish us as well. And through that, we are going to have very strong acts of non-attachment through Viveka, developing in, first of all, into a sattvic, purified mind, which becomes ready for preparation, which becomes prepared for meditation, and then takes us into the supreme reality, the supreme being. So again, the logic is quite clear as to how this is going to be done. What is it which we talk about when we talk about the acts of non-attachment, and what we are talking about when we are talking about the sense objects, desires, etc., and how that is going to lead us to the ultimate destination, which is the Uttam Purusha, Puruṣottama. So I think somebody has got their microphone on. If you can switch off your mics, please. So the next section is dealing with the Jiva and his journey. Sorry, we are talking about the goal and how to reach the Supreme Abode. So then the goal should be sought after, where having gone, none returns again. So remember, there are two processes which are taking place here. Number one is to cut down the strong tree with the strong acts of non-attachment. That's the first part. Then having done that, what Bhagavan is saying, then the goal should be sought after. And once you reach that goal, there is no return. It's a one-way flight. It's a one-way ticket. Once you get there, there is no coming back. And in this sense, it means that once the realization has taken place and you have realized the truth about yourself, then there is no descent back into ignorance, because it is the truth which is realized. And once it is realized, one becomes established in that, and that establishment is complete and eternal, and therefore there is no coming back. And of course, it means not coming back in two different ways. One is that once you get into the knowledge of the self, there is no knowledge of the ego, which is going to drag us back again. And the second meaning is that once we achieve that state of realization, then there is no coming back in terms of another birth. So I seek refuge in that primal Purusha from which stream forth from time immemorial all activity or energy. So the goal is that um, Supreme Purusha from which has come this all this activity and creation from time immemorial, which means that it has no beginning, no end. So let's look at verse number 5 in this one, which then tells us the relationship between these strong acts of non-attachment and the actual practices which are required. So we can just talk about here non-attachment, but how does it then relate to what we have to actually do in terms of our sadhana? So here's a strong acts of non-attachment. So the first thing Bhagavan says, free yourself from pride and delusion. Freedom from pride and delusion means what? I am deluded that I am this ego, and I have this pride that I am this person existing in the world, and I should be recognized as this ego identity. All that is gone. The delusion that I am this ego is gone, and the pride which I have in my ego identity, that is gone as well. Secondly, victorious over evil of attachment. Complete victory. And why do we call it the evil of attachment? Because that is what is binding me here. That is what is giving me suffering. Arjuna is actually suffering simply because of this attachment to his kith and kin. And he needs to become victorious over the evil of attachment. So do we, if we want to then release ourselves from the cycle of birth and death. So that is the second part. The third part, desires have completely retired. Completely retired. There's no kind of part-time retirement or you're doing part-time job. No, completely retired. In other words, there's no desire. Desire has been transcended also. Why? Because the vasanas themselves have completely burnt out. In the fire of knowledge, all the desires get burnt out, vasanas get burnt out, completely retired. That is what we have to work towards. And freed from the pairs of opposites. And the pairs of opposites only arise, why? Because there is duality. I'm the subject and here's the object. And in that subject-object duality, there is the like and there is the dislike. And this like and dislike is also related to various different pairs of opposites, like heat and cold. So at this moment, we have a bit of heat, and I like that. If it becomes cold in the winter, I don't like that. So like and dislike, pairs of opposite, freed from there. Why? Because we have transcended duality. So having done that, strong acts of non-attachment through these practices, we then come to what? We have to go to that goal. Remember the last verse? We have to go to the goal and dwell constantly in the self. So in this one verse, Bhagavan is telling us the process, the sadhana, what we have to do in order to escape from this cycle of birth and death. And Bhagavan says the undeluded, the delusion has gone. They reach the goal eternal. And the goal eternal is what? Uttam Purusha, Puruṣottama. So this Paramatma, which we talked about in chapter 13, is what Bhagavan is referring to here as Puruṣottama. It is the eternal Brahman, and that is the goal eternal. So you can see Bhagavan has kind of systematically told us what to do, how this non-attachment is going to come about, and how once that has come about, we kind of move towards dwelling constantly in the self. And when that delusion is completely gone, and the pride is gone, attachments have gone, desires have gone, and the influence of the pairs of opposites have gone, we reach that eternal goal. So remember that we have talked about this before, expression in the Jiva of Brahman. This is sentiency, control, function, movement, matter. And these are then kind of experiences are expressed in the body, mind, intellect. And I begin to think I am this Jiva because I'm having all this experience. They belong to me and they are mine. And I am this Jiva who is experiencing all these things. And in this state of ignorance that I'm this ego individuality, then I say to myself, I am this individual who wants happiness. And binding through the gunas, as we saw in the previous chapter, and this binding through the gunas makes me to experience myself as this me and mine. So again, looking at this picture of Brahman, perishable saguna, expression in the creation and Jiva as well, sentiency, control, function, movement, matter, and identification with the BMI, binding through the gunas. The me and the mind. And what we have to do here is what we have to do is non-attachment. Cut down the tree with the strong acts of non-attachment and dwelling in the self, we reach that imperishable goal, which is Brahman. So you can see the connection between what we talked about in the previous two chapters and what Bhagavan is telling us here is that at the heart of this particular thinking is non-attachment on the one hand, with the body, mind, intellect, and everything which goes with it. And then on the other hand, dwelling in the self. And in this manner, we are going to reach the supreme goal. And just a reminder of what we talked about in chapter number 13. This is really, again, the same kind of concept whereby developing certain qualities which Bhagavan mentions in this relationship to sadhana, cultivation of this quality, that is the means, the knowledge through which we are going to reach the ultimate goal. So you can see how Bhagavan kind of gives us a 360-degree view of how it can be done. Various different ways of analyzing it and seeing that, here's another way in which you can look at it, cultivate these qualities. And these qualities, as we know, are these ones which we described in chapter number 13. Cultivate these 20 qualities, and what will begin to happen is that you will start moving towards the ultimate destination. And in this case, Bhagavan has given the upside down tree and how to cut it and what are the ways in which that can be done as well. So I just want to kind of remind us of chapter number 13 again, where Bhagavan is saying how to know the Purusha and the result of knowing, because this also relates to what we have been talking about. And further on, Bhagavan also talks about that as well. So how to know the Purusha? In the previous chapter, previous chapter, he says by meditation, by Jnana Yoga, by Karma Yoga, and others not knowing this, worship through Bhakti Yoga, having heard it from others. And therefore he describes a different kind of pathway where we have where we can reach that supreme refuge. But of course, each one has got its own particular sadhana, the techniques which are there in order for us to follow that pathway. And then Bhagavan went on to say that sees that all actions are performed by prakrti alone and self is actionlessness. Remember, action is the one which binds. And if we go to the self, then it is about actionlessness. So when man sees the whole variety of being as resting in one and spreading forth from that one alone, he then becomes Brahman. So various ways of analyzing this knowledge in the sense of saying that, when we see that everything is resting in that one reality and spreading from that one reality is this upside down tree creation. If we see this clearly and own this knowledge, then we become Brahman. And again, looking at what we talked about in the previous chapter, as this is how Bhagavan talked about it in a slightly different way, whereby he's also talking about non-attachment and aversion to the gunas, becoming equal-minded, samatulya, and not initiating any further egocentric activities, so that this kind of equanimity begins to develop. And through that, one gets centered in the self, non-judgmental, non-reactive, and also non-active. So here's another way of looking at this whole kind of logic of how to reach that ultimate reality. And in this case, we are working on the gunas. And through the gunas, we center ourselves in the self, and we become the perfected one when we transcend the gunas. So then Bhagavan also talked about the means of perfection, and that means of perfection is becoming gunatit, going beyond the gunas. And Bhagavan says, I am the abode of Brahman, and the immortal, the immutable, and everlasting dharma of absolute bliss. So this supreme abode is what Bhagavan was talking about in the last chapter. And now he is also talking about the supreme abode, but reaching it through another set of concepts and ideas, which we talked about earlier as this upside down tree and what to do with the tree. So the goal and how to reach the supreme abode. So Bhagavan says, nor does the sun shine there, nor the moon, nor the fire, to which have gone, having gone, they return not. This is my supreme abode. So Bhagavan kind of describes it in a different manner here. He says, my supreme abode is where there is no sunshine, there's no moon, there's no fire. In other words, it doesn't mean it's a place of complete darkness. We have to understand what he means by this. And of course, we saw this in chapter number 2 as well, where Bhagavan says, that which is night to all beings, in that the self-controlled man keeps awake. The Gnani, he keeps awake. Where all beings are awake, that is night to the Muni, the sage. In other words, he lives in a different consciousness altogether. And this is what we are going to think about in this relationship to this verse. So sunlight, moonlight, firelight, what do? They illumine the objects of our perception. If you want to see something, you need some light. And that light is going to come from sunlight, moonlight, firelight. And specifically, sunlight is, the origin of all light. And then it kind of reflects on the moon and we get moonlight. Firelight is something which is then created within creation in this kind of way. And it allows us to see things. It illumines, as it were, the objects of our perception. So illumination in terms of Vedanta is equal to awareness through the mind and intellect. In other words, if I say my mind and intellect has been illuminated, it means within that illumination, I am aware of the thoughts and the feelings which are going on in my mind and intellect. So illumination is not this kind of physical illumination, but it is equated to awareness in our individual experience. And the supreme abode cannot be reached by that awareness. Why can't it be reached? Because the supreme is not an object of awareness. And therefore he says the sun cannot shine there, the moon cannot shine there, the firelight, there is no fire there. Why? What he means is that through my intellect alone, through language, through words, I cannot reach the truth. The language and the words can only point towards the truth, but it cannot be reached by this conditioned awareness in which I'm located. Okay, so what he says, there is no awareness there. It is pure consciousness. It is not conditioned awareness, but it is pure consciousness. And therefore, in order to reach that pure consciousness, I have to go beyond the identification with the body and the mind and the intellect. And remember, the Supreme Abode is not an object of our awareness. I can't say, I have seen Brahman. I have seen Atma. You can't say that because it is not an object of awareness. In order to know Atma, you have to become Atma. It is knowledge through identity rather than knowledge through perception. Two very different ideas. Okay, and here what Bhagwan is saying, that you have to know the Supreme Abode not by thinking about it, but by being Brahman. Only then you can say that you have reached the Supreme Abode. And that is the ultimate subjective reality, not the objective reality, but the subjective reality, which I say,
Daddy,
which I
Roger.
say is the supreme consciousness. Um, Kishore Bhai. So this cannot be illumined as an object, just like I was saying, but illumines the entire creation. It illumines how? It illumines because through my mind and intellect, I can see the totality of creation. It is as if the supreme consciousness is illumining the totality of creation, and it is perceivable by me through my senses. Once the self is realized, there is no more delusion. In other words, I have come out of the delusion that I am this body, mind, intellect, I am this ego identity. And once that happens, you have crossed the threshold. Once you have crossed the threshold, there is no coming back. Okay. So it is one way and there is no return. So realization in that sense, but also escape from or liberation from the cycle of birth and death. Let's go to the next bit, which is talking now about the Jiva, its journey, and recognizing Ishwara in the Jiva. So here Bhagwan is describing the whole process as to how this, combination of the Jiva and the Ishwara takes place. He says, eternal portion of myself, having become a living soul in the world of life and abiding in prakrti, draws to itself the five senses and the mind as the sixth. In other words, this prakrti, with this portion of the eternal, which is what Bhagwan says is myself, becomes this living being in the world, which is you and me. Bhagwan is describing you and me here. He's telling us, actually, there is an eternal portion of myself in you now, right now. And you have to recognize that. But meanwhile, what is happening, because of this, remember we talked about sentiency, where the Puruṣa and prakrti come together to give us sentiency. And when this is prakrti, which then begins to have this sentiency, draws to itself the five senses. In other words, it can operate by looking through the senses and the mind as a six, and therefore begins to function as an jiva, as an ego identity. When the Lord obtains a body as if, and when he leaves it as if, he takes this and goes with them as if the wind takes the scents from their seeds, just like the flowers. So there's the Lord. Looking at it from another point of view is, imagine that the Lord is taking up this body and then he leaves it. And as he leaves it, he takes the sense from their seeds. In other words, when the physical body gets separated from the Sukshma Sharira and the Karana Sharira, those are the scents which are taken away, the fragrance which has been accumulated as the vasanas. These are taken from their seeds, and then what happens? He goes to the next one. And then presiding over the ear and the eye and the touch and the taste and the smell, so also the mind, he enjoys the sense object. So as I said, it is looking from the other point of view, whereby imagine the Lord is sitting here and he's enjoying all this stuff which is going on, but actually he is not. It is as if he is enjoying. But in a sense that we are the lords of this ego identity and we enjoy the things which come to us as these sense objects. And Him who departs, stays and enjoys, who is united with the gunas, the deluded do not see. So this bit, this portion, which is the Lord himself, he is coming and going, as it were, and who is united with the gunas. When we are in that state of ignorance, we do not see it. And they behold him who possess the eye of knowledge. This eye of discrimination is when we have that, then we can actually begin to discern the divinity within ourselves and everything else. And so the seeker striving for perfection, beholding and dwelling in the self, but the unrefined, unintelligent, even though striving, see him not. In other words, it requires this eye of knowledge, which is a special eye of knowledge, which comes through very kind of strong discrimination and a strong acts of non-attachment. So the final section then talks about the Supreme Purusha, the nature of it, and how to know the great secret. So remember, Brahman with his various different upadhis, Adhideva, which he mentions in verse number 12, sun, moon, etc., Adhibhuta and Adhyatma, the earth and the herbs, which he talks about, and Adhyatma, which is Vaishvanara. And this is related to the food prayer we say as well. And also no upadhis. So if they're all the upadhis, which means the covering, upadhi really means the covering. And that covering of the Ishwara or the pure consciousness, in a sense, becomes the sun and the moon, it becomes the earth, it becomes the herbs, it becomes all the plants around us, and so on. And in our individual self, it becomes this ego identity where Bhagavan is existing as this fire within ourselves, this prana apana. And if all those are taken away, all the upadhis are taken away through the strong acts of non-attachment and absorption in the self, then we reach Paramatma. So again, the logic is clear, related to what we have been talking about before as well. So what Bhagavan says, that light which is residing in the sun and which illumines the whole world, and that which is the moon and in the fire, know that light to be mine. In other words, this is nothing but the manifestation of my own self. And permeating the earth, I support all beings by my energy. And having become liquid moon, I nourish all the herbs. And then going on to say, having become the fire, Vaishvanara, this digestive power, as it were, within the body. I abide in the body of all beings and associated with the prana and the apana, which are the five pranas which are located in prakrti, in the body, mind, intellect. And this is nothing but an expression of the Lord himself. So what he's telling us is that there is a part of this eternal within ourselves that expresses itself as this digestive power in a sense, and abides in the body and is associated with all the pranas which are moving around. Then that is the one which digests the fourfold food. So there are four different types of food, which I'm sure you know about, but these are all digested by the digestive fire, which is coming from the Ishwara himself. And what he says, I am seated in the hearts of all. From me are memory, knowledge, as well as their absence. I am verily that which is to be known in all the Vedas. I am indeed the author of Vedanta, and the knower of the Vedas am I. So the original knower of the Vedas, which he talked about in the first verse, the one who knows the Vedas, the leaves, remember, is the Vedavit, the knower of the Vedas. Bhagavan says, actually, that is me. So here's the progression of knowing the divine, and I'm sure that we are familiar with this now. So in chapter number 10, Bhagavan was telling us, first of all, begin to recognize this one seated in all. What Bhagavan has just described to us just now. A portion of me is sitting in you. Not only you and me, but everything in this universe, in this creation. There is this one in all, that one reality in all the diverse objects of our experience. And in chapter number 11, begin to recognize this cosmic person, all in one. Everything is located in, as it were, in this one infinite reality. And having the vision of these diverse objects of experience in this one reality is the next step. And then going further from there, the one reality, which in this chapter he talks as the Supreme Being. So Supreme Being is where we have to reach, and that is the process by which we're going to do that. And Bhagavan has already hinted to us that this creation, which he's describing as the upside down tree, consists of all these different elements. And he has described the sun and the moon and the earth and the herbs. And he has also talked about the digestive power in the individual as well. So manifestations of the divine and the progression of how to know the divine in various different levels, in various different aspects of our transactional life. Now here the next three verses are actually called the three shloki Gita. Gita in three verses. So this is the wonderful thing about this chapter. It also summary of the summary. And here's the summary of the summary, which describes the kind of whole packages, the whole Bhagavad Gita in three shlokas. And it's worth kind of memorizing these three verses. So Bhagavan says two Purushas are there in this world, the perishable and the imperishable. All beings are perishable, and the Kutastha is called the imperishable. Now we'll see what that means. But distinct is the Purusha, Supreme Purusha, called the highest self, the indestructible Lord, who pervading the three worlds, waking, dream, and deep sleep, sustains them. This is the Supreme Purusha which sustains everything, including the three worlds. And in the case of the individual, this is the waking, dream, and deep sleep worlds. And what Bhagavan says, I transcend the perishable and I am even higher than the imperishable. I am declared as the Puruṣottama, the highest Purusha in the world and in the Vedas. In other words, what is he saying? That there are three levels of reality which are being talked about here. Two Purushas. One is the perishable, the imperishable. Now this refers to the you and me as Jivas, all beings which are perishable, and the imperishable part, which is the part and parcel of this Purusha seated in us as the Ishwara. And beyond the Ishwara is the highest Purusha, which is the highest self. And that is called the Purusottama, the Paramatma, the highest Purusha, which is sustaining everything. Going back to the upside down tree, what is sustaining the tree which is coming down? It is the roots. From the roots is the tree, and that which is sustaining this tree are the roots which are nourishing and allowing this creation to come into existence. And that is nothing but the highest Purusha, the Purusottama. So Bhagavan says then, he who undeluded thus knows me, the Supreme Purusha, he all knowing worships me with his whole being, O Bharata. So once the delusion is gone, that I am this individual subject existing in this objective world, I am this ego identity, I am this person with this identity which is full of pride as well. I am that deluded self. And when I go beyond this delusion and know really that there is this Supreme Purusha, the ultimate reality, the Atma, Brahman, the all-knowing, once that delusion is gone, Bhagavan says, all-knowing, he worships me with his whole being. So going beyond the delusion is really the primary principle which we have been following. How to go beyond this delusion of, I am this body, mind, intellect, I am this ego individuality. How can I go beyond in order to reach the truth? How can I become gunatit? How can I become sthita prajna? And all these are ways of telling us that there is a way, here's the way, how this is to be done, with various different ways of explaining this knowledge to us in a very consistent and coherent manner. And Bhagwan says, this most secret science has been taught by me, O sinless one. On knowing this, a man becomes wise and all his duties are accomplished. Nothing to do now. Everything which needed to be done has been done and nothing more to do now. Which means what? It means that it doesn't mean that once you become realized, you become like a stone. It means that you as a person, as an ego individual, have got nothing to do, because having reached that supreme self, having reached the Supreme Puruṣa, there is no identification with the body, mind, intellect. I do not now think of myself as this body, mind, intellect who wants this, that, and the other. I and I want, that disappears completely, and therefore nothing to do. Not nothing to do in the sense of tamasic nothing to do, but rising even beyond sattva to say, in all these things, I remain actionless. Remember, we came across that idea in chapter number 3, 4, and this is what Bhagwan is talking about here. So that kind of brings us to the conclusion of the 20 verses. It's a short one, but it has, Bhagwan has very wonderfully kind of summarized the principles of Vedanta, of the Jiva, Jagat, and Ishwara in a beautiful manner, with his depiction of the Aśvattha tree hanging upside down, and how we can deal with that tree by cutting it with these strong acts of non-attachment. And we have seen the kind of sadhanas which are involved in doing that. And therefore, the next thing for us to do is to really, what are we going to do with all this knowledge? So again, to remind you about the 4 A's and the 4 B's and the 4 C's and the 4 D's. And each one of these is really part and parcel of our daily sadhana, to learn how to be living consciously, how to learn about ourselves and letting go, cutting those ties that bind, the 4 C's of commitment. How do we get commitment to this spiritual life? Is having this clarity, having this comprehension of this wonderful knowledge in relationship to our own individual self. And when that conviction becomes so deep, there is nothing which is going to stop us committing this whole life to getting to the truth. And then the 4 D's of attitudes of sadhana. Determination. Yes, you require determination. There is going to be devotion to this path, to this goal, dedication of our daily sadhana, and discipline, which will come as part and parcel of our daily life. All these are very important cornerstones of our spiritual life. So here's the homework. Read, reflect, listen to the content of this chapter, Yoga of Supreme Being, and understand this upside down tree. It's something which will not escape from your mind. Whenever you look at a tree, you will think of this upside down tree, and how this represents both the manifest and the unmanifest Brahman. Prepare a plan to practice the techniques given in this chapter, the main one being development of the strong acts of non-attachment, and the practical 5-point plan in verse number 15.5. So this one you can't forget. 15.5, 5-point plan. And if you memorize those things which we have to practice in our daily life, think how you can do that in your own life, and see how that practice brings about a complete inner transformation, which is not available by any other means. Okay? Sense of equanimity of the mind, a calmness, a coolness, a sense of contentment, shanti, santosh, samadhan. This will become more and more available as we practice this 5-point plan. And Bhagwan describes how divinity is present in all aspects of the manifest. Develop this vision, this Jnana Chakshu, where you can see the Supreme everywhere you turn. In the sun, in the moon, in the fire, in the earth, in the plant kingdom, and in yourself. As this sentiency, as this consciousness, the prana and the apana in every breath. Remember in pranayam we do apana, apana. Prana and apana is the ingoing and the outgoing breath. Every time you breathe, think of the Lord sitting here. Constant reminder. And there's no escaping because we have to all keep on breathing. And continue practice from all the other techniques in the previous chapter. And of course, intensified plan of meditation as well. If you already have one, if you don't, just make up a plan and start doing meditation. It's one of the most wonderful techniques Bhagwan has given us in chapter number 6. And that really is one of the most important techniques on this path of Jnana Yoga, Ashtanga Yoga, and therefore do include it in your daily life. So enjoy the sadhana, stay safe, stay well. We are just about to come down out of lockdown, although now we are not sure, but let's hope so. But do keep safe and do keep well. So thank you very much, and we'll just conclude with the closing prayers.
Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinah Sarve Santu Niramayaः Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu Ma Kaschid Dukha Bhag Bhavet Om Asato Ma Satgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityor Ma Mritam Gamaya Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnamevavashishyate Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Shri Guru Pyo Namaha Harihi Om